Okay, very good morning. Wednesday the 9th of August. Let's get straight into the morning briefing and talk about, obviously, North Korea. We talked about this yesterday in the briefing as we were looking at potentially what would need to happen in terms of the situation escalating for it to have a bit of an impact on the market. We were at the point on Monday morning we had reports from North Korea talking about the fact that they had made a technological breakthrough, the miniaturization of a nuclear device that could be put onto a intercontinental ballistic missile had been achieved. This is quite a kind of key technological advancement which opens up the kind of possibilities, and certainly in terms of what we'll look at shortly in the ranges of the kind of suite of missiles that they have in their armory. And then we had the sanctioning coming, which the US are kind of, under Trump, pushing strong backing for a high level of sanctioning against North Korea. North Korea obviously saying that they would respond with 1,000 times worse. And that's all kind of made a bit of sense in response to where we were yesterday morning. Hearing that type of rhetoric from Kim Jong-un is not unusual at all. And actually, as we've talked about before, when you think about the frequency of testing of which North Korea has been conducting since the year to date, it's something like knocking on 20 missile tests. And I think since Kim Jong-un came into power over the last kind of 3 years, there's been more missile tests in North Korea than there has been in the last 3 decades, to put it into a bit of context. So certainly developments on that side aren't new. Now, what has changed overnight and late yesterday, because you'll probably be coming in looking at your charts, noting you've had a generally negative Asia-Pacific session. Gold is higher this morning. We're up around $11. The Japanese yen has also seen some movement as well in the overnight session, a little bit of strength during Asia Pac hours. And equities, you can see in terms of the futures market, really started declining, gave back some of that initial pop to record highs that we saw. The S&P high, all-time high now, residing at 2488.5. The JOLTS job openings, record highs, acting as a bit of a catalyst, and markets kind of taking the thin trading conditions, exacerbating that move higher. But then ultimately we started to pair that move all the way into the close, and some after Trump spoke. Now, going over the comments firstly from Donald Trump, and I like the pictures that they've managed to obtain from the FT. Trump looking vehement as ever. But the comments here was that he said, North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met by fire and fury, and frankly, power the likes of which this world has never seen before. Quote, Donald Trump last night. This is an escalation in the sense that, well, really you need to go all the way back to President Harry Truman during World War II in 1945, the last time a Western diplomat, certainly one from the US, had used such direct confrontational commentary on a military level, such as what Trump said last night. This is not the standard practice of diplomacy and what we've been accustomed to ever since the end of World War II in the 1940s. Hence the reason why the market has seen this kind of flight to quality move overnight. And as I said, equities generally in Asia lower, following on from the move down that we've seen in US futures as well overnight, causing the DAX then center-left chart to gap slightly lower. But we found a bit of support here in the futures close to the lows that were seen kind of early yesterday afternoon. Treasuries fitting in step with that move then, so with the kind of weakness seen in global equity markets, T-notes up about 7 ticks, the predominant amount of that gain coming really at the opening of the Asia-Pacific session. So when the US markets closed and Asia stepped into the market, that's when we kind of moved higher in the US 10-year. You can see bottom right chart and we've kind of sat around there in a range holding on to that. But as you can see, Europe's not had much of a fallout as yet. And really what I want to talk about is, is this a game changer in terms of what Trump has said, and how much validity is there in this going into military engagement going forward, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of things to just look at here. First of all, what's been the response from North Korea overnight in terms of what Trump has said? Obviously is about fire and fury, this kind of escalation of word play. What North Korea have said is that they're now starting to look at deploying missiles in regards to targeting the area of Guam. So as you can see here, this map, let me transition. You've got North Korea situated here as the Korean Peninsula, so Pyongyang and Seoul. Japan, and then in the North Pacific Ocean, all the way out quite far in the sea way east of the Philippines, would be that island of Guam. Now this is important because it is predominantly American and Taiwanese, and so there is a US military base there, and this would be kind of the collateral damage, if you like, North Korea threatening, not to the level of we would target Japan, let's say, specifically, or Seoul would be the first kind of logical larger target. They're saying, you know what, we can fire a missile that can hit Guam, and so you start pushing us, that will be the first area to be targeted. Now, one of the things a lot of people look at when it comes to North Korea is the type of, when you think about the process and the history of North Korea, what the Western world has been monitoring for many, many years is about what type of level of technology do North Korea have. North Korea have been very vocal to push that they have made advancements, but in previous years gone by, this has proved not to be the case. The one thing, though, that has changed is a couple of things. First of all, what you have had was that Japanese annual defense white paper. We talked about that yesterday. That came out over the weekend. And they said it was possible that North Korea had already achieved the militarization of nuclear weapons and has acquired nuclear warheads. This is obviously in fitting with what North Korea have been saying themselves. So if you think back to George W. Bush, so he actually said North Korea had nuclear technology of a missile capability. And he was 10 years too early in making that statement from where they actually were and what arms they had in their arsenal at that point. So we've always kind of overemphasized the Korean threat, where technologically they're not at that point. The difference seems to be now is that most analysis would suggest that Korea have made quite a bit of catch-up. Now, the reason why this has become particularly interesting is because if you look at these types of missiles, so looking at a scale here, here's the picture of a normal average-sized person, and you get a scale of these type of size of these missiles that they're using. Now, the key here really is the distance in which these missiles can fly. And obviously, one of the big things which has created a bit of a stir from the US side is the fact that Korea have said they could hypothetically bomb the United States of America. Whether that can be the case or not is yet to be seen, but looking at the different ranges that these missiles could fire, it's the KN-14 model that could in effect hit Alaska, if you're looking on the most outer rim here. Now, one of the things here that would need to be as well in terms of the further distances to travel, so a maximum of 15,000 kilometers, they would have to be using the Taepodong-2 missile. To give you an idea, that has been used as the basis for North Korea's Unha space launch vehicle, which has put basically 2 satellites into orbit for North Korea. There is no consensus as yet or whether or not this could function as an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. So this longer ranged missile which technically has flown far enough to launch satellites for North Korea, it hasn't actually been used and proven as an ICBM. And that was the one that would need to be used in order to target these longer kind of areas like the United States. So there's still a bit of uncertainty over what exactly can be achieved here. But a couple of things that I would say you need to be aware of on commentary that has been made, because I think this puts into context where this situation might go next, and actually might explain why the market hasn't got too carried away with things at this point. One is Senator John McCain. Now, Senator John McCain is important because you might just know him as a senator and just that role, but actually he is the Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So he's very influential on the decision making that would happen if there were to be any military engagement. Now, he has made two specific comments. John McCain has said that Trump needs to be more cautious in his statements because he may not be able to make good on his implied threats. He also said it's classic Trump in that he overstates things. So this is the guy that's basically in charge of the armed services in the US, saying very questioning Trump's remarks. Don't forget, if there were to be a level of military engagement from the US side, it would need to have authorization, of course, within Congress. Not only that, it would probably need UN backing and so on and so forth. So that obviously dampens the likelihood that this would escalate. Another person, US defense officials, including Secretary James Mattis, all warn against the unthinkable cost of war with North Korea, whose nuclear, conventional and biochemical arsenals could reach US allies South Korea, Japan. So basically everyone barring Trump is saying this isn't a good idea, apart from Trump. And the one thing that you'll probably become accustomed to is when it comes to Trump, he's wanted to repeal Obamacare, he's failed. He's wanted to do corporate tax cuts, he's failed. So far, specifically because he hasn't had the political backing that's required to make these measures go through. So hence the reason I think that the fallout from what's developed overnight thus far has been relatively contained. A couple other things that to speak of here. One is when you start looking at this actual level of estimated nuclear warheads, it's actually quite phenomenal, really, when the US have 6,800 nuclear warheads. North Korea has 30 to 60. Russia obviously has the most, 7,000. So a lot of this going back into history, you know, the Cold War, this kind of standoff of military might. We have the capability, so don't try it because we'll fire with equal firepower, so to speak. But looking in the context of the size of what the capabilities are of each nation, you know, it's incredible the amounts that these two countries have in comparison to the rest of global powers out there. Britain, for example, only having 215. A couple of interesting things here. This was an article in Bloomberg I sent round in your email this morning. This is about what would a war between North Korea and the US look like, and I think it raises a few interesting points. For one, can the US try a surgical strike? If you remember, we had Syria only a few months ago. The US went in full force to target a couple of military air bases in Syria. This obviously was the beginning of the deterioration in what was a fairly warm relationship that Trump had managed to create with Vladimir Putin. After the Syrian situation, that's taken a pretty severe U-turn. But can the US try a surgical strike? What this means is, can the US essentially try to take out the various facilities where North Korea could fire these missiles? Now, the analysis would suggest that this would be incredibly difficult, just given the terrain and makeup of North Korea being very mountainous. And of course, if you were developing a place to fire your missiles, well, obviously that's exactly where you would do it if you were in North Korea, because that is a safeguard then against these potential disruptions that you could have from outside parties. The thing that would happen here is if you tried to do a surgical strike, essentially you're trying to take out all the major facilities that are developing these weapons in North Korea. The likelihood is you're not going to be able to do that 100%. If you were then to fire large-scale military action on North Korea and you do not take out 100% of their capability, what do you think the response would be from North Korea? It would be an immediate missile. Most likely the obvious target would be the 10 million people living in Seoul in South Korea, and then obviously Japan probably being the second most largest target, Tokyo. So it would be, I feel, an absolutely idiotic tactic to try and go for a surgical strike, because in essence you would not be able to do a clean enough job to take out everything, and that it would only lead to retaliation from Korea. And if Korea start firing missiles at Seoul, that then just the whole thing ramps up and we're back into World War territory, because if that happens, I'm sure the Russians will get involved, as will the Chinese, and then we're back to the 1940s again. Okay, point number 2. Why might Kim go nuclear? Even a limited strike by the US would run the risk of being understood by North Korea as the beginning of a much larger strike. So therefore, Korea becomes proactive and starts then firing missiles themselves. Is the regime option a change? New leadership wouldn't necessarily lead the way to new thinking among North Korean leadership. A lot of people had thought the point here is that Kim Jong-un was schooled in Europe. He actually was educated in Switzerland. And people thought that his father was quite an outlier in terms of his his view on the world, let's say, and his policies that he was imparting. But his son, if anything, has just ramped it up rather than move to a more Western way of thinking. The problem is that the common belief is that even if Kim Jong-un was removed, there is enough of a clique and tight group around him that they would just continue the same path. You would need to then, if you were to, let's say, Kim Jong-un has an accident like his brother, then you're going to have to need to do lots of a much wider scale operation, and that would seem, again, not a legitimate way of operating in terms of dealing with the problem. Does all this mean that all-out war is the best US option? This is point number 4. A full-scale invasion would be necessary to quickly take out North Korea's artillery as well as its missile and nuclear programs. Yet any sign of an imminent strike, such as a build-up of US firepower or mobilization of South Korean Japanese militaries, obviously would be seen by North Korea, and likelihood is North Korea might do a preemptive strike. So even moving of military could create more difficulty here. You've already seen this with Trump a few months ago moving a missile-capable US submarine to the South Korean peninsula, which again was kind of initiating this where we are at the moment, this situation. Economic turmoil obviously would be devastating if that were to happen. Bloomberg here, just looking at South Korea, accounts for about 1.9% of the world's total economy, home to very large companies. What options remain on the table? Well, the main thing is here, and this is exactly where I think that this is heading, is there needs to be a concession on the side of the US and the West in order to appease North Korea, and so that they feel that they don't need to up the ante, so to speak. This can only really be solved diplomatically. If you ever did get to a point of the US military strikes on North Korea, this would only spell the beginning of a much bigger, broader global confrontation. So hopefully this gives you a bit more context to this. My overall thoughts, as you probably gathered, are I would keep an eye around the opens this morning for any potential feed through into this first couple of hour or so of European trade once the markets settle. But I don't think that at this point, we have not yet got to crisis point on this issue. One very interesting stat here, we're on the precipice of nuclear war, and the Dow Jones finished down yesterday 0.15%. So let's not get too carried away that this is becoming a bigger issue than it is right now. If I look at the VIX, this is the VIX index. Now, the VIX did see a little bit of a move higher, but it finished at the wholesome level of sub 11. So it's not exactly at levels which, if you think about it, heading into the first round of the French election, the VIX, which is this big peak here, you can see on the chart, this is year to date, we were trading at about 16 in the VIX. We are now at 10.96. So if you were using this as a barometer of the fear in the market about these types of situations, then if you talk about back in mid-May when all this talk about Trump, his involvement with Russia and so on and so forth, that was that peak. This was the French political risk peak going in. You can see this collapse in the VIX after Macron won. You know, we are, in the grander scheme of things, still very relatively low. So I would be looking for more kind of conciliatory comments to come from Western powers on this situation in order to de-escalate what's happened here and to counteract the kind of more emotional response that's been issued by Trump, would be the way I'd kind of look at things. Okay, let's come off Korea. Let's have a look at oil, because we did have, of course, the API crude oil inventories last night, and a fairly interesting reaction here. Let's go back to a 5-minute chart. Let's go back to 9:30, obviously when this data gets released. If I just scan back here. So that was the movement that was seen on the back of the API crude oil inventories. So as you can tell there, over that 5-minute period, a high degree of volatility, but not really much in the way of outright direction. If anything, we drifted a little lower in the period thereafter. Looking at the actual numbers, if you haven't seen them already, the headline crude figure was a drawdown of 7.839 million. Expectations were for a drawdown of just 2.2 million. So much larger drawdown in the headline figure. The only problem is here, as you can see in the crude chart, is we reacted more bearishly thereafter, and that's because the gasoline figure came in with a much bigger build than expected. 1.5, expectations were for a draw of 1.5 million. So it looks like what happened here, and this is kind of the headline that Zero Hedge are running, confused the algos, and what they're referring to is the fact that the market originally blipped higher. It reacted to the first piece of information, the headline draw. Then, on assumption of the crude oil report as a whole, the gasoline was bearish and we paired back. This is a classic example of why trading these crude oil reports or these inventory data reports are very difficult, because you're trying to navigate through multiple variables of different measures. It isn't just about the headline. And don't forget, of course, we'll have the crude oil inventory report later from the Department of Energy. We also get layered in with this the US output number, which is also very important. Just on that note, talking of OPEC, we've had some comments this morning from the Saudi oil minister, has said on Twitter that greeting Iraqi counterpart, says to discuss a joint effort to stabilize the oil market. That's the latest. Okay, so quick look at the calendar for the session ahead. Just before I quickly move on, we did have the Chinese inflation data overnight. Now, haven't really mentioned that because from a market moving point of view, the market really is not looking at that. It's looking at the Korean situation, certainly in terms of Asia Pacific trading hours. But just to give you an idea, the data all in all was basically a touch softer than expected, but broadly in line. You can see here the PPI and CPI measures fairly steady. Let me just show you the chart that I was just looking at here, was this one here. So as you can see, the pattern has been constant, and so no real great surprises here from the Chinese data overnight, outweighed by the North Korean focus. Going through the morning, there's not a great deal coming out for UK and Europe. And then we go into the US afternoon. We've got wholesale inventories. These are revisions though at 3 o'clock. We've also got some labour cost data out of the US, and then the Department of Energy report numbers, usual time at 3:30. No central bank speakers there on the docket. So overall, this is a fairly quiet calendar. I would be probably just keeping an ear out for any follow-up from various heads of state on their thoughts on Korea. Of course, keep an eye on Twitter for if Trump comes out with anything else. But I wouldn't be expecting him to go any further than what he said yesterday at this point. Looking at the charts, just as I finish off the briefing, keeping an eye on the DAX, we're just down at around those lows that we printed yesterday before we had that big surge and run up catalyst around that US data from yesterday when we hit those fresh record highs. Currency market wise, the pairs, not too much going on in the euro. We had a little bit of a pop in the sterling currency when UK participants came in. No real outright sterling news. This looks more a bit of a technical breach of the high seen from late yesterday. That also with the move back through pivot, just seeing a bit of a run up in prices, and we steadied now, finding a bit of a floor at the pivot level. Okay, short briefing for this morning. So have a good session. Any questions throughout the day, please just feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be happy to help. Okay guys, have a good day. Thank you.